Okay, well, in the second edition of our book, An Introduction to Statistical Learning, we've added a chapter about multiple testing and false discovery rates. So we thought it'd be really nice to have a conversation with one of the founders of the inventor of false discovery rate, Yoav Benjamini. Welcome, Yoav. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
I've probably known you for 30 or 40 years, which is a little scary because I know you visit Stanford often. And I think I met you as I was a student there, and of course many times afterwards. So we'd like to hear a bit about sort of the history of your famous 1995 paper on false discovery rates, which is, I think, one of the most cited statistics papers of all time. Maybe you could say a bit about how that work came about, what previous work inspired it?
Let me start by saying that I was a student of Tukey, and actually because of him, I entered statistics, but not because of his work in multiple comparison, but rather his work in visualization, exploratory data analysis, and so on, which attracted me. So while studying multiple comparison, I was never attracted to it, and so difficulties in general in that. But coming to Tel Aviv, Yossi Hochberg was there. And Yossi was really one of the experts in the area. He had encyclopedic knowledge in the area. And in 1987, he finished his book with Tamhane, which is still today sort of the fundamental, most expensive book. But Yossi, at some point of time, became the head of the statistical laboratory and encountered suddenly a clinical trial which had many endpoints, something like 80, 90 endpoints. And so became interested. That was very unusual in those days, but he became interested in these issues. And encountered a paper by Schweder and Sprottwall about testing significance en masse, where he had graphical ways of looking at the plot of p-values, and since those that conform to null hypothesis should look linear, and from the linear part of the plot you can estimate what is their number, and you can reject the other ones. And Yossi asked me whether we can do something algorithmically about that. And we had some method that looks at the p-values, very much like what is being done now by lambdas and so on, but going back and having an estimate of M0. And we plugged this estimator of the number of null hypotheses into Bonferroni, into Hochberg, Holm, and it was working very nicely. So that was the first part.
And so this started from real data, some real.
It started from a real challenge.
Yeah.
From a real challenge. Yeah. It was clear that if you use the Hochberg plot like Bonferroni Center, you will not discover anything. Yeah. So the challenge was real. Of course, at that time, nobody in FDA or something like that would have used it, so it wasn't put into that. Then there was the paper by Zorich in 1989. This was a very interesting paper in JASA, that in which he actually analyzed the problem of multiplicity if you use the 0.05 level all across it. And his conclusion was that there is danger that much of statistical discoveries are wrong. It sounds familiar, I think, because Ioannidis, 20 years later, wrote that he has a proof that most of statistical discoveries are false. But Zorich argued the same ways that Ioannidis argued, by looking at the number of false discoveries and the number of discoveries made, and looking at the ratio. And he said that this should be a warning to not use, trivially the 0.05 level. So Yossi read this paper and gave it to me. He said he thinks there is something deeper in the paper than merely this warning. And a few days later, we had the first version of the paper, because we utilized the estimator of M0, the estimate of the number. And we get the maximum and so on. And so the procedure was there, the adaptive procedure. So we sent it to Tukey, and Tukey only corrected the number of pages. They said, when you send something to me, you have to write the numbers down for the page. And no, he didn't recognize any of that. Julie Schaefer, and Yossi himself was also, as I said, an expert in the field. So we went out and sent it. So this is the background of it.
How long did it take to catch on? Did people catch on to it immediately, or how long did it take?
Well, it took 5 years to get it published. It published only in 95. It was accepted in 94. Interestingly, the first round was very productive for us because, we use the criteria, which is expectation over expectation. And if all null hypothesis of truth, it doesn't give any protection. We also tried the conditional one, which is the one story used, and it didn't give you any protection. So the first round, we made the correction and went out, but it wasn't received. It wasn't received well. It was. We were asked for. There was. Let me say this. There was always one referee who liked it and one referee who objected to it. And the editor or associate editor was saying, I'm obliged to reject it. And this way it went 3 journals, this way. One of the interesting points was that we were asked to do simulation. We did the simulation running from 4 hypotheses, 8, 16, 32, and 64. And the reviewer, upon getting to that, objected and said, who is going to test 50 or 100 hypotheses and ask for multiplicity correction? So that's the kind of objections we got. And of course, by the year 2000, with QTL and with microarrays and so on, much of it is over. But I think another important point in the acceptance of the idea was Dave Donahue's visit at Tel Aviv University. He spent a sabbatical and had a chance of, we had a discussion. At that time, I thought it's appropriate also for model selection. And Dave got really very interested in that, and Ian Johnson, and then we had this paper that also took about 5 years to get. But I think it brought it to the attention of the people in Stanford, and so you were one of the many of the important contributors to the field.
Well,
Just to finish one point, interestingly, the original paper, 95 papers, was not the original paper. We had to drop the estimation part, the adaptive part, and that one, when we sent it for publication, to JASA, the reviewer said, I don't believe the paper was accepted by JSS. And if it was, there is nothing novel in trying to estimate the number of null hypotheses, and it's not useful. So that paper was accepted only in 2000, so that's 10 years.
Well, when you hear these stories, I'd heard the story about the original paper taking 3 journals in 5 years. So, I mean, I think it's good for all of us to remember, we all get papers rejected almost all the time. And when we hear that such a great paper took so long to get accepted, it's reassuring just to keep going. Right? Yeah. It is,
But I had some who didn't.
That's right.
I can still remember Ian Johnston telling us in a biostat seminar about this paper when it first came out. And that's the first time I heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was very excited. He was very excited.
Sorry?
He was very excited.
So the paper moving into a penalty function and so on really opened the entire theory around the area.
You mentioned Ioannidis' 2007 paper about saying that most published studies are false, are wrong. Do you agree with that, or do you think he's being somewhat pessimistic?
Well, first of all, as I said, Zorich made this statement before,
right.
And it had an outcome. And the outcome was that there was a method that can control the false discovery rate. So, and Ioannidis didn't understand this point at all and went in wrong direction, attacking the p-values and significant testing and so on and so forth. Now, as to the point itself, the paper, of course, doesn't make any statements, empirical statements about that. But I think that what happens is that we forget that science relies heavily on the fact that no discovery is considered approved or substantiated with no replications by others. And this goes back to Bohr in the 17th century that puts this up as a fundamental. So there will be papers, and there are papers with false discoveries, and that's fine. That's fine. Many of them are not interesting, and no one will care even to try to replicate them. But if they replicate, and it is checked if they are important, and that saves science. So in some areas, like psychological research or in health and food, food and health and so on, the original studies immediately catch headlines, right, and then they become false. An example is, from the last weeks, Dan Ariely's work on that was found as fabrication. How was it found as a fabrication? People tried to replicate it, true, about 5 years later, and couldn't replicate it. And then they started to dig into the original paper and found, and I don't think fraud is not a serious problem in science. It is more selective inference which is not evident in the paper, selective evidence which is in the paper. But that's the way science goes. So there are false discoveries, and many false discoveries. Okay. It's okay. We don't need just high-level, big data, big experiment, expensive experiment in order to make progress in science.
Now, there's been a move in some journals, especially in statistics, to ban the use of p-values. What is your feeling about that?
That's if it were only some papers, it was okay. The point is that it's our American Statistical Association, which also made an effort in this direction, misguided effort. Because what happened simply is that p-values in significant tests are the most widely used. So when it comes to study replicability problems, it's always in the language of p-values and so on. And especially in psychology, p-values were put to blame, and the response was by ASA was a committee with no agreement even among the members of the committee, and some people taking over. There was no consensus there. Now, interestingly, the most recent statement by the task force that Karen Kafadar put together, that already you're familiar with. Brad Efron was a member, and Sean Bank, and so on. This came with a strong statement that the p-values are legitimate and are helpful, just as any other statistical measure, and also presented some principles to using any statistical measure in order to address applicability and the robustness of studies and so on. So I hope that it will change, but the damage was done. The damage was certainly done.
Well, I remember that session at the JSM. You spoke in the session as well on defending p-values and opposing the ASA's position, I think. This was maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah. There was. I think I was the only person in all three initiatives. So I was a member of the ASA guidelines that were published. I participated in the conference that Wasser thing has made, and following that there was an editorial which was not an ASA statement but was interpreted as such, and finally in the last one. And I can testify that only the last committee we did reach consensus, at least within the committee, about the statement. So I really see that as a diverse body of people, and I think it should reflect a wider consensus in the profession.
Now, we've talked mostly about, your work on false discovery rate in your original paper. Is that the work you're most proud of, or is there a hidden gem that you'd like the world to know about?
Well, it represents the beginning of a long journey where later on there was the important contributions were the work with Yoav on confidence intervals and dependency. Maybe I'll say a word about this confidence interval issue, because that was the first time that during the work we realized that we're talking about something different. And that's a distinction I've been making between simultaneous protections and between on the average over the selected. The false discovery rate being on the average over the selected by significant testing. And confidence interval, you can do it by selection by that, or selection by passing a threshold or something like that. And that will give us a different property, the selection, on the average over the selection. And so this is really fundamentally, I'm proud of that. And of course, there were later the usage to clusters, which came out of MRI analysis, and to medical research with weights and so on and so forth. But let me mention a completely different field of animal behavior, which I'm proud of. Okay, and this is back in 87, as all Ilan Golani came to our statistical laboratory and said his rats know to count up to 8, and he wants a statistician to prove that. Okay, rats can count up to 8. And when we started to look at that, it turned out that rats, exploratory behavior of rats, they make stops, and the maximum number of stops that they are making is 8. Well, when we looked at the data, not every rat is doing to 8 and so on and so forth. And an extremely nice example of a real uniform distribution arising in nature. So that's a nice point. But this started a continuation of research until today. And an interesting point that came along this research is the point that I realized that replicability hinges upon correct specification of the variability. So there are two cornerstones to replicability, and one is the selection, and the other is the correct variability. And the point was in research that we had comparing many laboratories, and we saw that in each laboratory, many endpoints. So the mice walk out and make stops, and we count the number of stops and how much distance they go, and so on and so forth. And some of the measures had very significant interaction. And this was interpreted as saying that the measure is not replicable if you have a significant interaction, but because that means that each laboratory has its own effect. And it turned out that the best measures with very small variability had huge interaction. Yeah. And then we realized that this interaction should be inserted into the variability. And actually, in statistical terms, a mixed model should be used rather than a fixed model. And working that out and using that for me, it was it had more meaning, because in the year 2000, Tukey published a extremely strange entry in the encyclopedia. I mean, you've never seen it or heard about it. In the encyclopedia, together with Val Johnson. And it talked about completely two different things. One is mixed model versus fixed model, and maybe using a compromise of that. And the other was FDR. And what's the connection between these two? And we wrote, together with Henry Bone, we wrote a paper about Tukey's contribution, and we didn't mention it because I didn't know what to do with it. And this GXL, as we call it, genotype by environment interaction, suddenly I grasped that Tukey was talking about replicability. And he saw exactly the point that it's the mixed model that captures the right variability. And to bring it to, to the points that I'm sure appear in the book, if you do a cross-validation, you can choose random subset to cross-validate, k-fold cross-validation. But a better way to assure applicability is to find those extreme, strange groups that are different from one another in some sense, and do the cross-validation this way. This will give you a good handle about the replicability of the results. So you might do it both this way and that way, but actually taking very different groups in that sense will help you to get replicable results. So that's another one that I'm very happy about it, and we are trying now to implement it both in psychology with another student to find and to make it into a replicability enhancing procedure together with this
Fantastic.
selective inference.
Well, Yoav, our time is up. This has been really interesting. You're clearly a real scientist, and you've made incredible contributions to the field. So thank you for spending time with us and sharing some of your thoughts.
My pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Yoav.
You're welcome.
Take care.